You're not my wife anymore. This property is part of our marital estate. You need to pack your things and leave.
Preston, you can't do this.
It's about time.
Preston had spent years treating my silence like surrender. Standing on the dock of the lake house my grandfather built, he declared me irrelevant in front of witnesses, with his mistress wearing my mother's hat and his mother already settled into my family's furniture. His confidence rested on a single assumption, that I had no ground to stand on, but my father had spent a lifetime quietly making sure I did. The question Preston should have been asking himself wasn't whether I would fight back, it was whether he had any idea what he was truly up against. If stories like this one speak to you about dignity, about knowing what you're worth, and about the quiet power of standing your ground, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. My grandfather built the first room of that house with his own hands, sometime in the early 1950s, when Blue Heron Lake was still more dirt road than destination. My father grew up in it, added to it, repaired it season by season until it became the kind of place that holds a family together without anyone ever having to say so out loud. The kitchen was painted yellow because my mother, June, believed that a kitchen should feel like morning even at dinner time. The reading chair by the window was worn down on the left armrest because my father, Arthur, always rested his coffee mug there. The staircase banister had small pencil marks, climbing up one side my height, recorded every birthday until I was 17 and told him I was too old for that. When Arthur died, he left me the house and a letter. The letter was short. He said he hoped I understood that the house wasn't worth anything on a balance sheet, that its value lived in the people who had loved each other inside it, and that I should never hand it to anyone who couldn't see the difference between a home and an asset. I was 42 when I read that letter. I thought I already understood what he meant. It took 2 more years for me to realize I had married exactly the kind of man he was warning me about. I met Preston Vance at a fundraising dinner for the food distribution organization where I worked. He was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately understood its geography, who had money, who wanted it, who was pretending not to care. He came and found me by the volunteer table, which I remember thinking was unusual for someone wearing a watch that cost more than my car. He asked about the logistics of the supply chain, the cold storage capacity, the last-mile delivery challenges. He seemed genuinely interested. He made me feel like the work I did every day, the spreadsheets, the grant applications, the 5 a.m. warehouse calls was something worth paying attention to. The first time he visited Blue Heron Lake, I watched his face as he stepped onto the dock. I was looking for something, the particular softness that came over people who recognized a place built on love rather than money. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, scanned the tree line, looked out at the water, and said it had potential. I told myself he meant us. I told myself he was imagining summers here, mornings on the water, a life that could take root in a place like this. I believed that for a long time. Preston was attentive in the early years in the way that certain men are attentive when they want something present, warm, carefully calibrated. He brought flowers to my office on ordinary Tuesdays. He remembered the names of my coworkers. He was polite to Arthur in that deliberate way that reads as respect until you realize it's performance. After Arthur died, the performance ended. Within a year, Preston had suggested renting the lake house during summer weekends to generate income. Within 2, he was asking me to consider a renovation that would gut the yellow kitchen entirely. Within 4, he had introduced the phrase marital asset into conversations about a house that had never belonged to him and never would. I kept saying no. He kept acting as though my no was a mood that would eventually pass. His mother, Lorraine, had never approved of me with any subtlety. She made comments about the lake house, the way some people make comments about a scar with just enough softness in the voice to suggest they were being kind by pointing it out. She felt Preston should have more control over the property, more say in how it was used, more access to its value. Preston never disagreed with her when I was in the room. He just looked at the floor, which was its own kind of answer. The marriage had a rhythm by the time it started breaking apart, and the rhythm was this: Preston decided and I adjusted. Preston criticized and I explained myself. Preston came home late or not at all, and I convinced myself the explanation he gave me in the morning was probably close enough to the truth. The gaps in his story were things I chose not to examine, because examining them would have meant acknowledging what I already suspected, and I wasn't ready to do that until the evening. I drove past his office building and saw Sloane Barrett walking out beside him. Sloane had been his executive assistant for about 8 months by then. Preston had mentioned her with increasing frequency, her efficiency, her instincts, her understanding of the market. He had compared her to me exactly once in a way that was meant to sound like a joke but wasn't. I had let it pass. I let a lot of things pass. But seeing the two of them on that sidewalk, the way his hand settled at the small of her back with the ease of long habit, told me everything I had been refusing to let myself know. I drove home and sat in the kitchen until he came in just after 10 o'clock. He looked at my face and seemed to understand that the particular version of this conversation he had been preparing for had arrived. He didn't apologize, he explained. He said the marriage had stopped working years ago, that I had retreated into grief after Arthur's death, that I was more attached to the memory of my parents than I was to my own life. He said Sloane understood the world he lived in. He said I had never really tried to. He used every good thing about me as evidence for why I had failed him. My work with the food bank was proof I prioritized strangers over my own family. My refusal to renovate the lake house was proof I was stuck in the past. My love for my parents was proof I couldn't function in the present. By the time he finished, he had taken the most honest parts of who I was and arranged them into an argument for why I deserved to be left. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until he went upstairs, and then I called Marion Keaton. Marion had been practicing family law and asset litigation for over 20 years. She had a way of listening that made you feel like she was taking inventory not of your emotions, but of the facts underneath them, the structures and documents and legal arrangements that emotions tended to obscure. She told me to pull together every piece of paperwork connected to the lake house before I did anything else. I told her I thought I already knew what was there. She said she suspected I didn't, and she was right. The person who clarified things was Walter Briggs, who had been maintaining the lake house since before I was born. Walter was in his late 70s, methodical, not given to unnecessary sentiment, but faithful in a way that only made itself visible in small, consistent acts. A repaired shutter, a winterized pipe, a phone call to let me know the dock needed new boards before the season started. He was the one who told me to look at page 9. Page 9 of my father's estate documents was not where most people would have thought to look for something important. It was buried in the middle of a section on administrative trust provisions, which is probably exactly where Arthur intended it to be. What it described was the Carver Family Preservation Trust, which had held the lake house since Arthur formalized it the year my mother died. The terms were uncomplicated. I was the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee. No spouse, partner, or creditor had any claim to the property. No one could sell, depreciate it, mortgage, or occupy it without my written consent. Anyone who remained on the property after that consent was revoked could be removed as a trespasser. I sat at my kitchen table reading the same paragraph 4 times. Arthur had built that protection quietly, without ever telling me, and he had built it the year June died. The year he understood for the first time how quickly a life could change and how important it was to make sure the things that mattered couldn't be taken from the people who remained. He had known, in the particular way that quiet men sometimes know things, that someone might one day try. Preston filed for divorce 3 weeks later. He framed it publicly as a mutual decision that had been a long time coming. He told people I had struggled since my father's death, that the grief had changed me, that he had tried to support me but eventually had to put his own well-being first. The version of me that existed in those conversations was fragile, difficult, emotionally unavailable. It bore no resemblance to the woman who had spent 18 years managing a household, a career, and a marriage largely on her own, but it was a useful story, and Preston had always been good at useful stories. His initial filing included a request for temporary access to the lake house during the divorce proceedings. Marion noted it, flagged it, and said we should watch what happened next. What happened next was a phone call from Walter, 3 months after the filing, on a Saturday morning in late June. His voice was careful in the way it got when he didn't want to alarm me, but had no choice. He told me Preston had arrived at the lake house the evening before, using the key I had given him years ago. He had not come alone. Sloane was with him, and so was Lorraine, and so were 2 moving trucks. And the process of settling in for what appeared to be an extended stay was already well underway by the time Walter called. I understood immediately what Preston was doing. He wasn't taking a vacation. He was establishing a pattern of use, laying a foundation of occupancy that could be pointed to in a courtroom as evidence that the property had functioned as a shared marital space. He was trying to blur the line between my inheritance and his claim, and he was doing it while I was 3 hours away, presumably too grief-worn and conflict-averse to do anything about it. He had spent 18 years learning my habits, my thresholds, my tendency to go quiet rather than escalate. He had concluded, based on all available evidence, that I would absorb this the way I had absorbed everything else. I called Marion from the car as I pulled out of my driveway. She listened, said she had been preparing for exactly this possibility, and told me she would have the trust documents couriered to the county sheriff's office before I arrived. Then I drove. The whole way up, I thought about the letter Arthur had left me, about the phrase he used, that some people only see the value in a thing, never the meaning of it. I thought about the morning I read page 9, and the feeling that came over me. Not quite grief, not quite relief. Something closer to the recognition that my father had known exactly who I was and had spent years making sure that knowledge protected me, even after he was gone. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the lake house, the anger I had been carrying since Walter's call had settled into something steadier. I was not going there to fight. I was going there because the house was mine, because my father had made certain of it, and because there are moments when the most important thing a person can do is simply show up and refuse to be made invisible. The late afternoon light was coming through the trees the way it always did at that hour, dappled and golden across the dock boards, and for a moment the place looked exactly the way it had always looked, like somewhere that belonged to people who loved it. Then I saw Lorraine on the porch steps with my grandmother's teacup. I saw Sloane at the sliding door. I saw Preston standing at the edge of the dock with the posture of a man who had already decided how this afternoon would go. I got out of the car, and I walked toward them, and I did not look away. Preston saw me coming across the gravel and didn't move. He stood at the edge of the dock with his arms loose at his sides, and his expression was one I recognized, the particular calm of a man who has already decided how a confrontation will end and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. He had worn that expression in boardrooms and at dinner parties and in the middle of arguments in our kitchen, and it had worked on me for 18 years. I was counting on him, not realizing it had stopped. Audrey. He said my name, the way people say the name of someone who has shown up uninvited. I think we should talk about this like adults. Behind him, Lorraine rose from the porch steps with my grandmother's teacup still in her hand, watching the scene arrange itself with something that looked almost like anticipation. Sloane stayed near the sliding door, wearing my mother's straw hat at an angle that made clear she had tried it on and decided to keep it. 2 movers were working behind her, carrying boxes through the front door of my family's house as though this were a normal Saturday afternoon. I told Preston I needed all of them off the property. I told him calmly, and I told him once. He smiled and explained that as my legal husband, he had every right to access marital property during an active divorce proceeding. Sloane added, from her position near the door, that I was making an uncomfortable situation worse than it needed to be. Her tone was the tone of a woman who had been rehearsing the role of the reasonable one. Lorraine moved down the porch steps and said loudly enough for the movers and Walter and the neighbors along the lakeshore to hear that it was a shame how grief could make a person irrational. When I asked Sloane to remove my mother's hat, Preston stepped between us. That was when the last of his careful framing came apart. He turned to the small audience that had gathered the movers. Walter, 2 neighbors who had drifted toward the fence line, and he said it clearly, without lowering his voice. "You're not my wife anymore. You have no authority here." He wanted those words to land like a verdict. In his version of this afternoon, that sentence was the moment I understood my position and stepped back from it. What he didn't know, what he had spent 18 years not learning about me, was that I had never needed his permission to know what I owned. I said, "I heard you," and I walked past him into the house. The inside stopped me for just a moment. Sloane's perfume had already settled into the hallway, something expensive and unfamiliar layered over the smell of old wood and lake air that I had known since childhood. One of her scarves was draped over the armrest of my father's reading chair. Lorraine's luggage sat at the base of the staircase. 2 wine glasses were on my mother's kitchen counter, and the photograph of Arthur and June that lived on the mantel, the one from their 20th anniversary, the 2 of them standing on this very dock, had been turned face down. I set it upright. I looked at their faces for a moment, and I told them silently that I was sorry it had taken me this long. Then I closed the front door and turned the lock. From outside, I heard Preston try the handle. Then I heard him knock, sharply, the way a man knocks when he is certain the door will open. When it didn't, he knocked harder. I walked to the security panel in the hallway and went through it methodically. I cleared every guest code, revoked Preston's keypad access, and called out to Walter through the side window, asking him to rekey the gate and notify the marina that Preston's boat was no longer authorized at the dock. Then I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office and told them I needed someone at Blue Heron Lake. Preston's voice came through the door, still controlled but with an edge working its way in. He said I was making a mistake. He said I was going to regret this. I went to the kitchen window, the one above the yellow-painted sill my mother had done herself the summer before she got sick, and I opened it a few inches. "You can't treat me like a stranger when you want your freedom," I said, "and then treat yourself like my husband when you want my property." He told me the house was part of the marital estate and I was obstructing a legal process. I told him Sloan had 30 seconds to leave my mother's hat on the porch railing before I added theft to the incident report. Sloan's voice rose from somewhere near the dock, indignant, but I had already moved away from the window. Sheriff Roland Pierce arrived 20 minutes later with a second officer and the folder Marion had couriered to the county office that same morning. Roland was thorough and unhurried, the kind of law enforcement official who had seen enough property disputes to know the difference between a domestic argument and a straightforward question of title. He reviewed the trust documentation, spoke briefly with Preston, and then explained the situation in terms that left very little room for interpretation. Preston's own divorce filing, Roland noted, had explicitly stated that he and I were dissolving our marriage. That filing, combined with the Carver Family Preservation Trust documents, established clearly that the property had never been marital property, had never been subject to division, and that Preston's presence on the grounds without my consent, which I had now formally revoked, constituted trespassing. The trust had anticipated exactly this scenario, and my father had written the language to withstand exactly this kind of challenge. Lorraine tried, briefly, to reach someone on her phone who might intervene. Preston tried to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, a temporary emotional reaction on my part, something that could be resolved without official involvement. Roland listened to both of them, and then asked the movers to begin returning the boxes to the trucks. Sloan left my mother's hat on the porch railing, without being asked again. She walked to Preston's car and got in, and did not look back at the house. Lorraine followed, still performing dignity, though the performance had fewer spectators than she would have preferred. Preston stood at the gate for a moment after everyone else had gone, and I came out to the porch to watch him leave, because I needed him to understand that I was not watching from behind a curtain. He said I would regret this. I told him the only thing I regretted was the key. After his car disappeared down the gravel road, Walter came and stood beside me on the steps. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he thought Arthur would have liked how this afternoon went. I didn't trust myself to respond to that, so I just nodded and went back inside. I thought the hard part was over. I had not yet read far enough into my father's files to understand what the hard part actually was. Marion came to the lake house 4 days later, and she brought 2 boxes of documents with her. She had been reviewing the full scope of the Carver Heritage Land Trust, not the Family Preservation Trust that held the house, but the larger collection of land holdings Arthur had assembled quietly over several decades. The trust held parcels along the lakeshore, sections of forest, a stretch of wetland, several lots with water access, easements that controlled how the connecting roads could be used. Arthur had put them together one piece at a time, the way he had done everything without announcement, without asking for recognition, simply because he saw what was happening to places like Blue Heron Lake and decided to do something about it while he still could. As Marion laid the documents across the kitchen table, I began to understand the shape of what he had built. He had watched development companies move into lake communities and systematically eliminate the features that made those communities worth living. In the public fishing spots, the accessible shoreline, the ability of families who had been there for generations to stay. He had bought land not to sell it, but to protect it. And he had structured the trust so that his intention would survive him, with me as its steward. I was still absorbing this when Marion told me about Preston's project. His firm had been developing a proposal for a high-end resort community on Blue Heron Lake for nearly 2 years. The renderings showed private boat slips, luxury lakefront homes, a waterfront restaurant, a gated entrance. It was positioned in the marketing materials as an environmentally responsible development, the kind of language that made the environmental review process more complicated and the public opposition easier to dismiss. What the renderings did not show was the access corridor that ran through Carver Heritage Land Trust land, a corridor without which the project's most valuable parcels were landlocked and effectively worthless. Preston needed my consent. He had needed it before he filed for divorce, Before he sent Sloane to sit beside him at the charity auction, before he started comparing us in the particular way designed to make me feel like I was failing him. He had needed it the first time he stood on this dock and called the house a property with potential. I sat with this for a long time. I thought about the years I had spent adjusting and explaining and making room. I thought about how Preston had understood, from very early on, that this land existed and that it was protected in ways that could frustrate his plans, and how he had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to find a way around that protection, first through persuasion, then through pressure, and finally through the legal leverage of a marriage he could claim gave him shared access to what was mine. I thought about the fact that even the assault on my grief had been strategic. If I could be made to seem emotionally unstable, my refusal to cooperate with the project could be dismissed as irrationality rather than principle. The part that was hardest to sit with was not the betrayal of the marriage. I had already begun to grieve that. What was harder was the possibility that my father's death had been, for Preston, as much opportunity as loss, a moment when the most protective presence in my life was removed, and the path to what he wanted was clearer. Every push to renovate, to rent, to transfer, to share had come after Arthur was gone, and had intensified as the resort proposal moved closer to the phase that required the land trust's cooperation. Preston had one advantage I kept returning to: resources. His firm had attorneys, investors, a public relations infrastructure, and the credibility that came from being a man in a suit with a glossy presentation and a projected revenue figure. If I opposed the project, he would make sure the opposition looked personal, a bitter ex-wife weaponizing an inheritance to punish a man who had moved on. That was already the story Lorraine was telling at dinner parties. It was a story that required no evidence because it relied entirely on people's willingness to believe that a woman's anger could never be principled. I stood on the dock that night after Marion left, looking out at the water in the dark. Somewhere down the shore, a family had a bonfire going, and I could smell the smoke and hear the low sound of voices carrying across the water. My father had thought about those families when he put this land in trust. He had thought about the people who had been here long enough to love the place, who didn't have the capital to compete with developers but had the kind of investment in a community that doesn't show up on any balance sheet. I thought about what Arthur had told me, standing on this same dock when I was young, that a locked door isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of a boundary. He hadn't just been talking about houses. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and the 2 boxes of documents Marion had left behind, and I began making a list of every person I needed to call in the morning. The weeks that followed were the most useful of my life in ways I hadn't expected. I had spent my career organizing logistics, moving food from warehouses to the people who needed it, solving problems of supply and access and distribution. It turned out that understanding how land trust documents worked, how watershed protections were structured, how shoreline easements could be challenged or defended, was not entirely different from understanding a supply chain. It was all a question of who controlled the connection points and who had the authority to close them. I met with a conservation attorney named Douglas Fenn, who had spent 30 years working on exactly these kinds of cases. I spent an afternoon with a wetlands ecologist who walked me through the eastern edge of the Carver Heritage Land Trust land and showed me what the resort's proposed drainage rerouting would do to the marsh habitat there. I sat in Walter's kitchen one morning, and we spread the parcel maps across his table, and he showed me, line by line, what my father had put together and why each piece mattered. I began to understand the land not as a legal asset but as a functioning system, one that Arthur had spent years protecting precisely because he understood it that way. I also started talking to the people who lived around the lake. Not about the project at first, just listening. An older woman named Teresa Navarro had been on the South Shore for over 50 years. She told me her husband had died on the water, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning when he was out fishing the way he had every Tuesday morning for the last 20 years of his life. She told me her grandchildren came every August and swam off the public dock at the end of Lakeview Road. She had never thought of that dock as something that could be taken away, because it had never occurred to her that anyone would want to. The development hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late September. Preston's firm had done its preparation thoroughly. The conference room at the county planning office was arranged to favor their presentation, large screens, professional renderings, a table of attorneys and consultants positioned to convey institutional confidence. Preston arrived in a dark suit, flanked by Sloane, who was serving in some consulting capacity now, and by Lorraine, who had positioned herself in the front row of the public gallery as though her presence constituted an endorsement. The renderings were genuinely impressive. Private lakefront homes with tasteful architecture, a waterfront dining terrace, landscaped walking paths, a small marina. The language used to describe it was carefully chosen. Sustainable, community integrated, economically beneficial. Preston's lead consultant presented projected job numbers and tax revenue figures with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that confident arithmetic tends to go unchallenged in public forums. None of the slides showed the families who would lose their road access. None of them showed the public fishing area that would be fenced within the resort's private perimeter. None of them showed the wetland drainage map that Douglas Fenn had annotated for me in red. When the public comment portion opened, Teresa Navarro was the first to stand. She was small and deliberate at the microphone, and she spoke without notes. She described her husband's Tuesday mornings on the water. She described her grandchildren in August. She said she had attended enough meetings in her 81 years to know when a presentation was designed to make people feel like the future had already been decided, and she said she wanted everyone in the room to understand that it had not. Then she looked at the planning board and asked them directly. When every access road had a gate and every dock had a private membership requirement, she wanted to know who, specifically, the progress was for. After Teresa, others stood. A mechanic who had grown up on the North Shore, a retired school teacher who had taken generations of students to the lake for science fieldwork, a young father who had bought his house 3 years ago because of the public water access and was now being told, for the first time, that it might not be permanent. Walter stood and spoke briefly, in the plain way he did everything, about what Arthur Carver had believed about the land and why the trust existed. The room had shifted by the time he sat down. I was the last to speak from the public. For most of my marriage, I had managed my presence in Preston's world by making myself smaller, quieter at his firm's events, more careful in conversations with his colleagues, less willing to take up space that he seemed to need for himself. I had done it gradually enough that I hadn't noticed I was doing it, which is the particular danger of adjustments made in the name of keeping peace. Standing at that microphone, in a county planning office, in front of the man who had spent 18 years trying to redefine who I was and what I owned, I was aware of a very simple decision. I was not going to make myself smaller. My name is Audrey Carver, I said. Not Vance, Carver. I am the trustee of the Carver Heritage Land Trust. I told the board what the trust held and why it held it. I told them about my grandfather building the first room of the lake house by hand. I told them about Arthur watching, over decades, what happened to lake communities when development moved faster than people's ability to protect what they valued. I told them that the access corridor running through Carver Heritage Land Trust land was not an administrative technicality in this project, it was the project's spine, and the trust had not consented to its use, and would not. Then I said what I had come to say about the proposal itself. There is a version of progress that measures its success entirely by what it adds for people who already have resources, I said, and nothing else. This project is that version. A place does not become more valuable because wealthy people have decided to pay for exclusive access to it. It does not become less valuable because it has been loved for 50 years by people who can't afford a private slip. And a lake does not become worth protecting the moment a developer decides it's worth developing. It was worth protecting long before that. My family knew it. The people who spoke before me tonight know it. I am asking this board to know it too. I formally stated, for the record, that the Carver Heritage Land Trust declined all requests for easement, access rights, land transfer, shoreline modification, or development cooperation associated with Preston's resort proposal. Then I stepped back from the microphone. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms sometimes go quiet when something has been said that requires a little time to settle. Preston caught up with me in the parking lot, his composure shed somewhere between the conference room and the exit. He said I had done this to hurt him, that the whole thing had been about Sloan and the divorce, that I was using a dead man's paperwork to conduct a personal vendetta against someone who had simply moved on. Sloan isn't important enough for me to ruin a lake over, I told him. He said I couldn't block progress forever. I told him I wasn't blocking progress, I was blocking him. Those were two different things, and the distinction was not complicated. One of his investors had followed us out and was standing close enough to hear the exchange. I watched the man's expression shift from politely disengaged to quietly attentive in the way that investors' expressions shift when they are recalculating risk. Preston noticed it too, and the calculation of what it meant moved visibly across his face. What followed over the next several weeks moved in the way that institutional things move when their foundation has been removed, not dramatically but inexorably. 2. Investors requested revised feasibility assessments. The County Planning Board ordered a full environmental impact review, citing the wetland concerns Douglas Fenn had documented. A local reporter contacted me and asked if I would be willing to talk about the land trust and its history. I said yes, and the piece published the following week laid out the facts in sequence, and the sequence was damning enough on its own. By November, the project had lost its primary capital commitment. Preston's firm placed him on administrative leave, describing it as a restructuring measure. Sloan relocated to Atlanta for a position she had been pursuing independently. Lorraine stopped calling people in her social network with her version of events after 2 of them asked why Preston had brought his girlfriend into his wife's family home while the divorce was still pending. I didn't track these developments closely. Marion kept me informed of what was legally relevant, and Walter mentioned the rest in the course of our regular conversations about the property. I was spending most of my time on the land trust work, which had expanded considerably since the hearing. Douglas and I were developing a long-term stewardship plan. Teresa Navarro had introduced me to a network of lake residents who wanted to be involved in formal conservation efforts. There was a lot to do, and doing it was absorbing in the particular way that work absorbs you when it matters. The morning Preston came back was a Tuesday in late October. The sky, the flat gray of late autumn, and the leaves almost gone from the birches along the lake shore. The gate camera sent an alert to my phone, and I saw his car idling at the entrance. Walter was at the property and offered to handle it. I said I would go. I walked to the gate and stood on my side of it. Preston was alone, no briefcase, no attorney, no careful presentation of any kind. Just a man in a coat that looked slightly too large for him now, standing on the wrong side of a locked gate. He said the project was finished. He said he might lose his position at the firm. He asked me to consider amending the trust's position, now that the legal proceedings were winding down, as a gesture of resolution. I told him the trust's position would not change. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gate latch he couldn't open. Then he said something that surprised me, not because it was untrue, but because I hadn't expected him to say it out loud. He said the lake house had always made him feel like he was standing outside something, like there was a world here that had existed long before him and had never quite let him in. That's because love isn't the same thing as ownership, I said. You kept confusing them. He asked me, finally, if I had ever actually loved him. I told him yes, genuinely, for a long time. I told him that love had been real. What it could not do was survive being used as a mechanism of extraction, being asked, over and over, to prove itself by giving something up. At some point there was nothing left to give, and that was not a failure of love. That was just what happened when someone spent long enough treating tenderness as a resource to be managed. He said he was sorry. Standing there in his too large coat on a Tuesday morning in October, without any audience and without any angle, I believed he meant it. It didn't change anything. Some apologies arrived too late to do the work they might have done earlier, and this was one of them. I told him to take care of himself and walked back toward the house. I didn't look back. Not because I was being dramatic about it, but because there was genuinely nothing I needed to see. The following spring, the Carver Heritage Land Trust partnered with the County Parks Commission to formalize the public access areas around the lake, the fishing spots, the swimming dock at the end of Lakeview Road, the walking trail along the eastern wetland edge. A small stewardship center was established near the North Shore parking area. We named it the Arthur Carver Lake Stewardship Center, and on the morning we put the sign up, Walter wore the nicest shirt I had ever seen him in and spent most of the dedication ceremony looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man working hard to hold himself together. I had a plaque made for the entrance. It read, "Preserved in memory of Arthur and June Carver, who believed that land only truly belongs to people when it is loved." That evening, I sat on the dock as the sun went down over the water. The boards shifted slightly under my weight, the way they always had that small, familiar creak that Preston had called mournful and outdated. He had wanted me to replace them with composite decking. I had said no, and I had been right, because the sound those old boards made was not mournful. It was continuous. It was the sound of something that had been here for a long time and intended to remain. When Preston told me I was no longer his wife, standing on this same dock in the middle of what he assumed was his victory, he believed he was taking something from me. He was not. He was freeing me from the obligation to protect him from the consequences of who he was. He was returning to me the name I should never have set aside, the voice I had been keeping at a reasonable volume for 18 years. And the knowledge clear and permanent now that the most important thing my father had ever given me was not the house, and not the land, and not the trust documents on page 9. It was the understanding that knowing what you own is not the same thing as being willing to defend it. And that the defense, when it comes, begins with a single, quiet, deliberate act. You walk through the door, and you turn the lock, and you do not apologize for what you have protected. Because some people will only understand your value the moment they lose access to it, and by then, the gate code has already been changed. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, I think you'll find more here that speaks to you. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling stories worth holding on to.